Just an old sweet song keeps Georgia on my mind.
It was once a beacon of reform and a bastion of resistance to Russian revanchism in the South Caucasus and the former Soviet Union. But today, the words most associated with the Republic of Georgia are democratic backsliding and creeping Russian influence. And these two things are not unrelated. We've all got Georgia on our minds. So what's happening there and what can be done about it? Hello from SIPA headquarters in Washington, D.C., and welcome to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. And joining us here in the studio today are two former Georgian ambassadors to the United States who just so happen to be visiting Washington at the moment. David Sikharulidze, I hope I pronounced that right, who also served as Georgia's defense minister, and Batu Kutelia, who also served as Georgia's intelligence chief and deputy secretary of the Security Council. Welcome to the podcast, Dato and Batu. And it's great to have you both on and great to have you both here in Washington.
Thank you for the invitation. Thanks for doing this, Brian.
Always my pleasure. And also with us in the studio is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Nice to have you. So to set up the discussion, consider the following. 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, Georgia's direction seemed absolutely clear. The country was moving west. Public opinion supported this. There was a consensus about this in the political establishment. Georgian democracy, although not perfect and not without its hiccups and glitches, appeared stable and strong. There didn't seem to be much space for Russia to regain its dominance over the country. And yet, here we are today. Last year, I made 4 trips to Georgia, and each time I returned here to Washington more worried about the country's future. I saw a society becoming increasingly polarized. I saw the electoral system becoming increasingly rigged, and I saw the criminal justice system increasingly being used against opponents of Georgia Dream, the ruling party. And I saw a government that, despite going through the motions of pro-Western rhetoric, was becoming, in fact, more pro-Moscow in its behavior. And this has not gone unnoticed here in Washington. Just recently, Senators Jim Risch, a Republican from Idaho, and Jeanne Shaheen, a Democrat from New Hampshire, two very good friends of Georgia, by the way, sent a letter to Georgian Prime Minister Georgi Gakaria criticizing the government's backsliding on democracy. It seems to me that Russia, this is what I want to discuss today, Russia has learned its lessons from the past and is playing a very, very clever game in Georgia. It's doing the equivalent of boiling a frog in water. Dato and Batu, before we unpack all of this, because there's a lot to unpack here, I kind of want to get the perspective from both of you. How did we get here? Batu, if you want to go first,
Brian, again, thank you very much. It's great to be at SIPA and have this chat. And Georgia is a very important player in the region because Georgia proved in the region that democracy can survive and statecraft is successful. Democratic statecraft is possible. What Russia is trying to do to undermine this. That's why Russia perceived Georgia as a threat for its ideology, Putin's ideology that liberal democracy is failing, what he voiced recently in the G20 summit, formally declaring that he is willing to suggest something new. Unfortunately, but the Georgian government is importing Russian type of a sovereign democracy in Georgia. And you mentioned the word glitches. So to use again the technological phrases, these glitches are a result of the bugs that Russia is bugging Georgian democracy from inside. This is part of the hybrid war, and these bugs are with the two nature, one political and one economic.
Well, I want to actually drill down on this a little bit, and Don, feel free to jump in whenever you want. But was this a spetsoperatsiya? Or did Russia simply take advantage of a situation? If you look, George, it's a core question. Bidzina Ivanishvili lived in Russia he lived in the Soviet Union and then afterwards in the Russian Federation for most of his career. He made his money there, although I think we could have a discussion about whether his money is actually his money. And then he pops on the Georgian political scene, miraculously in 2012 and wins an election. admittedly at a time when the population had kind of grown tired of the United National Movement and Mikhail Saakashvili, the former president. So that the timing was very opportune for a new movement to appear on the scene. Initially, this movement appeared on the scene with the support of what I would consider the Democratic parts of the Democratic part of the electorate. Irakli Al-Hassani's Free Democrats, the Republicans. You had a very broad coalition that gathered around Bidzina, but over time he's kind of pushed them out. Do you see was this a Russian spetsoperatsiya from the start, or was it just opportunism? And Dato, please jump in if you want to as well.
Yeah, I think that was in the part of the bigger spetsoperatsiya of Putin against democratic world. So if we compare the attempted state captures that Russia and Putin is undertaking in Central or Eastern Europe, in Georgia, in Ukraine, you will find a lot of similarities, a lot of the same tools, a lot of similar enablers, and these former oligarchs who are now under Putin's control are instrumentalized to exercise the state capture.
So Firtash in Ukraine, Plahotniuk in Moldova, Ivanishvili in Georgia, Medvedchuk in Ukraine, Ivanishvili in Georgia. Dato, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, I agree with Batu. But we should not oversimplify this thing. Yeah, interference from Russian side, yes. Using this oligarchic mechanisms, yes. But also, there is the democratic process. And then, of course, there were mistakes made by UNM. And then after being 9 years in the power, there was a time for change too.
Right.
So, to blame everything only on the Russian special operation, that would be incomplete way to look at it. So I think that, yes, and then it's nothing new from Russian side. They always prefer to have not only at their front lines, but also their allies.
Right.
Undemocratic, run by, in different countries by the different clans. So they think that their influence can be better maintained in this way. So that's the way they operate.
Right. I mean, something that always strikes me about Georgian politics, a couple of things strike me about Georgian politics. You tend to have, and since independence has been the case, you had a democratically elected governing majority with an overwhelming majority, and then that governing coalition begins to rule in a slightly less than democratic way as time goes on, and then it's replaced by another faction with a overwhelming majority, and then it kind of backslides into democracy. We saw this happen with Sikharulidze. We saw this happen with Shevardnadze. We saw this happen with Saakashvili to a lesser degree, but and the most progress was certainly made under Saakashvili. And I'm wondering if the same thing is going to happen again now, if we're in that period now, and how this is going to play out. The other thing about Georgian politics that really strikes me is how polarized and tribal it is, but yet it's not about issues. Everybody basically agrees on the Western direction of the country, but you have this deeply polarized tribal politics that is basically personal. It's Misha or Bidzina. Am I right? And Don, again, you've been uncharacteristically quiet, but I want to get you in here. But let Batu answer.
Again, since you injected this technology phrases, the glitches, I'll try to do the analogy for the technology world. Democracy is an operational system designed by the West. It has been coded and applied then different devices or let's say countries. So Georgia downloaded this operational system. There are glitches, but it is that are the glitches that can be corrected by the ones who wrote this code. And there are others who want to hack this code. And Georgia, during these 30 years of independence, constantly were on the edge of the system error. That displays on the screen.
I like that metaphor. That's
and the patches. So, and with American support, with Western support, we successfully avoided several times the systemic error. Now, with this oligarchic informal rule, we are again at the verge of this system error. It's cyclical, there are improvements because we had quite a long period in recent Georgian history of moving state, institutionalizing processes, fighting corruption. And that really upsetted our enemies.
Right.
But it proved that this operational system that we downloaded for our country is really working. But again, glitches will remain. We just need to correct those.
I very much like Batu's comparison of Georgia to what's going on. No, before that, elsewhere, Ukraine. And so I have a number of questions I'm never satisfied with, one of which is what you gentlemen just talked about. Is it opportunistic by the Kremlin or something else? Number one is, and when I'm there in your lovely country, the continuing ghost, not of Ivanishvili, but Misha. People still bring him up, or he's there quietly in a way. And is the anti-Misha reaction still a force? Is it become something else in this download? Because he's there behind the curtain almost as much as Bidzina is, first. And second, how did this happen, as we talked about the other day, where Ukraine appears for now to be more on an upswing? What's the difference? Because in many ways, the relationships, political system, on paper at least, have a lot of similarities. And I hope it's cyclical, but maybe not. And I asked myself, what are the differences between one and the other country? NGOs are pretty active in both places. Is it the amount of interest in the West, which is spotty even in Ukraine? I just don't have a good answer. So I'm very much interested in your points of view. And the other thing I would say is that in Georgia there was a war first and then the backsliding, and then Ukraine is reversed in a way. And the sequence is different. Does that make a difference? And in particular, the war issue, which all of us went through and covered, like Brian and myself, it was kinetic and then non-kinetic, and in Russia it's sort of been the reverse. But please, I ask you a lot of stuff, but it's very interesting. There are lessons learned here, we can learn here, that are applicable to Ukraine and Moldova too, I think. Yeah.
The pattern is similar, but the case that you brought is the different cycles or different phases are a result, I think, of the Russian ability to conduct two special operations, inability to conduct two special operations in the same time. So they did war with Russia at that time. Strategically, they considered that was important in South Caucasus. Once they thought that the Georgian state is failing, then they did Ukraine. So that's why, as Brian yesterday you were mentioning, you cannot go to those two countries in a same synchronized development.
At one time, be optimistic about Ukraine and Georgia at the same time. When I'm optimistic about Georgia, I'm worried about Ukraine. When I'm optimistic about Ukraine, I'm worried about Georgia, which is the case right now. I think another
difference also what we have, unfortunately, in the current instant picture is that Georgia got only one oligarch. Ukraine
exactly what I was going to say. You have oligarchic pluralism in Ukraine, and that's hard for Russia to control because a lot of those oligarchs are pro-Western, and they share. The oligarchs effectively share power in Ukraine. In Georgia, you have state capture by one oligarch who's connected to Russia. So, Dato, did you want to add anything here?
Yeah, well, on question that is that still a fight between the two personalities? Well, that's increasingly Ivanishvili wants to present entire Georgian politics that is fight as between two personalities, but I think it's more more nuanced than that. Yeah. And for this reason, the idea of having the fully proportional elections, which would allow other political parties to have the representation as they have support, well, the logical representation which shows their support among population, was the way to somehow create a more, the coalition type of government. Right. And then, but unfortunately, after openly promising it, Ivanishvili stepped back from the promise, and then he still increasingly tries to make it again this clash, and then his description is for this is that whoever is not for me, he's against me, and then that may turn bad for.
Do you think he is doing Moscow's bidding? Or do you think he's, is he an asset or a useful idiot? I guess is the way I can't think of a better way to put it or a more polite way to put it. But how would you characterize?
Well, Brian,
this?
I would prefer to look at it from the point of what is the result.
The result is clear.
Yeah, what is the result? The result is the most important, because otherwise we can, we have to take a wild guess. So
right.
We are not intelligence people, and then
right.
so on. So what the result is, that is now Georgia more vulnerable to Russian influence or not?
Absolutely.
In my opinion, yes. And then, Russia is fighting this hybrid war, is not really the only with the military means, but also with the economic means, with the financial means, with the propaganda means. So if we put question, is Georgia now more vulnerable, less resilient to the Russian influence? My answer is definitely yes. Our dependence on the Russian market went up. Our propaganda operates, and anti-Western narratives became stronger. Current research by DFR Lab, by U.S. Atlantic Council, and Facebook showed that this were the kind of orchestrated accounts. We are using also, among other things, heavily using anti-Western narratives.
Well, we all witnessed this back in September during the McCain Institute's Tbilisi conference, when the Alliance of Patriots stormed into that conference room, which to me, this would have been unthinkable even a couple of years ago, that such a thing would happen in Georgia, with Mrs. McCain in the room. That was shocking to me, and I didn't think that happened by accident. I don't think the government was ignorant of that move, put it that way. So these kinds of things, this dramaturgy that you see in Russia, these kind of manufactured scandals and confrontations, that looked very familiar to me. Go ahead.
It's a very Putinesque way of doing things. So, answering your question, whether he's useful idiot or deliberately is doing it, again, it does not matter. But in fact, what he's doing is that he's downloading Putin's operational system in Georgia, squeezing out the democratic institutions. And therefore, all these manifestations that happened at the McCain Institute conference, also quite obvious government manipulated, supported troll factories that are not only demonizing their opponents or insulting or coercing them, but also spreading anti-Western and anti-American propaganda, is very alarming. It's like a copy-paste of the Putin's methodology. And nobody has a second thought why this so-called Patriots Alliance attacked the conference. There was a two major panel going on. First was the former NATO Secretary General Rasmussen speaking about Georgia's accelerated membership possibility in NATO. That is quite an innovative concept, but is getting more and more traction in Georgia as well as outside of Georgia. And second, there was an Russian opposition panel. There were Russian dissidents who were not allowed in Russia speaking in Georgia about the democracy and the importance of supporting democracy.
Yeah, and that was the moment when they bust into the room. It was during that Russia panel, and Ambassador Teft was actually on the stage, if I'm not mistaken, at the time. What I want to do in the second half of the show, I kind of want to get into. I love your metaphor of the virus and the operating system, and I want to start talking about patches and stuff in the second half of the show. But what I want to do just briefly is kind of hit on a couple of things that I think are emblematic of where we are right now. One is the electoral system in the 2020 elections and the fight over proportional representation and single-member districts, which sounds like an arcane thing, but is actually really, really important in this context. The second that I want to talk about is the Anak Aliyah port project and the criminal case against Batu Kutelia and overall the politicization of criminal justice. And finally, and this goes to your troll factory, the kind of polarization of society and to what extent this is real and to what extent this is manufactured. Let's start with the electoral system. I mean, this has been the subject of demonstrations in front of the parliament that have been going on for months now. The ruling party had made a promise to reform the electoral system. The electoral system as it stands allows for the use of administrative resources in these single mandate districts. The opposition has long called for proportional representation, a system under which you would get a much fairer result, and the opposition incidentally would do much better if they can unite. Where do you see this now? How do you see this playing out at the moment? How do you guys? I mean, I was optimistic for a time, and now I'm not. It seems clear that we're not going to get proportional representation. Where does that leave the opposition going to this election cycle, which is in October?
The important thing here to keep in mind why we got into the deadlock. The primary reason is that the Georgian dream currently holds the amount of power which they don't deserve or public do not trust them to have. Mm-hmm. So the legitimacy of them continue to run the country is under question. Therefore, the proportional system and the recent public opinion polls produced by IRI and NDI clearly shows that the opposition will be getting more than the ruling party.
So they'd have a governing majority.
So Ivanishvili and Georgian Dream, obviously in a fair election with a fair system, will be losing the power. And they do not want to do it, but the problem is that they are saying that, yes, we know that we are losing the power, but we will not let you to take this power because we prefer to stay in power. And that's why they are polarizing situation. That's why they are bringing, Misha versus Bidzina, or who are not with us, it's against us. Therefore, proportional system is not panacea per se, but in this context has a very important meaning to leveling the playing field.
Dato, Don, anything to add on this?
I think that's a brilliant explanation.
I think that's pretty much where we are. I mean, this is kind of the technical manifestation of a deeper ill that's going on.
But we get back to the question, friends, of why is this continuing? What break do we have on any of this? And I don't have a good answer.
That's for the second half of the show. We're gonna try to hammer that one out.
Just very briefly, just to add. I mean, no, I completely agree. It's a very twisted situation we have now. It's not only that we have this state capture situation when this oligarch has all power without any accountability, institutional accountability mechanism, but also what is happening in parliament. So during the last elections, if I'm not mistaken, the GD got much less votes than the percentage they control in the parliament. So I think that, the entire idea of the going to the full proportional system was that to adequately
reflect
representations in
and this is like the system. I like you. I'm glad you brought up the system of informal rule. My colleagues like to tease me about that. I'm always talking about the Russian Sistema, which is based on informal rule. This is the bedrock of the Russian Sistema. It is informal rule, and it's been kind of imported to Georgia now. It's not entirely alien because Georgia was part of the Soviet system, and that was largely based on these kinds of principles. But you have, again, Bidzina Ivanishvili does not hold any government posts, does not hold any responsibility, but everybody knows he's in charge. So when officials come to Tbilisi, do they meet with Prime Minister Gakeri? Probably for protocol. But the real important meeting is the one with Bidzina, and this is when I get into the kind of like the patches to this virus. In the second half, I want to talk about that a little bit. The other thing I want to talk about is this polarization of society, and part of this is tribal. Part of this is, do you wear a Misha t-shirt or do you wear an anti-Misha t-shirt? But part of it is also based on these using so-called traditional values and using the Orthodox Church and creating this impression that if Georgia moves west, that somehow its traditional values are going to be compromised, which is an absurd argument. Ireland is a very traditional society, as is Italy. and yet they are firmly embedded in the Western democratic system. So I think, but this, how much is this working? How much of this is manufactured? Because it is really striking, the consensus you find in Georgian society about we want to go west, we want to go to the EU, we want to go to NATO, we want to be a U.S. ally. But then when it gets into the minutia of traditional values, LGBT rights, feminism, all of these things are, how much is this real and how much of this is manufactured?
Well, I think a lot of dividing lines on macro or the micro level is artificially amplified. Every society has its own division lines. The difference is that whether the political system allows to bridge these gaps or just the opposite, to push sides on a different aisles. And with the propaganda tools, Russia, its proxies, they are trying to capitalize their power on the division line. The problem we have is that unfortunately government, instead who is designed or supposed to bridging these gaps in the society and having national consensus on various issues, they are themselves part of this polarization effort. But again, there are polarization. It's a growing pain. Georgia is a young democracy, and we are slowly learning a lot of things, how to build an institution based, not personality or clan or nepotist-driven society based on the rule of law. Unfortunately, but with this informal governance, which is obviously now is very well entrenched in Georgian system, we are moving in a different direction. So that's the difference, Don, you mentioned with the Ukraine. Georgia is going downswing while Ukraine is going.
Brian's question, Ukraine has a church now that has broken off to go westward. Can I ask, I want to raise another issue, also perhaps, Brian, better for the second half, but let me ask it here, which is to say, is this where it's going? Is Russia okay with this? Is this going, Brian and I
think Russia thinks they're winning, but I think they think they're winning.
Or is this enough for Moscow? We do talk about Sistema, but there are different forms of it, and it oozes around like a fog. What's going to happen next? Is Georgia going to get further close to Russia, or is this kind of chaos, uncertainty good enough?
Well,
or is it the frog?
To answer your question, just a little bit going back to Brian's question, and then I agree with Batu, and then there is another powerful line too of the Russian propaganda and the Russian generated propaganda. It's one thing is that West is against traditional values, which is of course crazy, and then not really many people can believe it. But the second is to spread nihilism. If you want to defeat nation, the number one tool would be spreading nihilism. Spreading nihilism about NATO membership or EU membership. That's not going to happen. Nihilism about what sometimes people say that this is the post-Soviet country. They naturally must be corrupt and then ruled by clans and something.
The West doesn't really want you.
The West doesn't want you. You're doomed to be ruled this way. This is the way it's always been. This is the way it always will
be. Which is not true. This is but this propaganda line is much more dangerous than propaganda line that says that it's against Georgian. So that's, and then this is we can see. So the Georgia is not really capable of doing something. That's not capable of modernizing itself.
It's always been corrupt.
Yeah, and then that was why Putin went against Georgia, partially also because Georgia started to prove that no, we are not. And then if we can, others can as well. And then even book was published why Georgians did it.
Right. No, and this is true. I mean, I've often said this is a war of governance right now. And Georgia and Ukraine and Moldova are on the front lines. They are the West Berlins of this situation.
Before in my opinion, to end this, I'm optimistic. So
I'm an optimist by nature, but right now it's really stretching my ability to be optimistic. The last thing I want to, before we get into kind of the what is to be done part of this, Batu, yesterday you said when we were talking off mic that the Anak Aliyah port project and the criminal prosecution, the criminal case against Batu Kutelia, that is kind of a microcosm of all of the way, of the whole Russian operation in Georgia. Can you explain that? Because I agree with you, but I'd like to hear it from you.
Well, yes, Anak Aliyah case is a symptom of all the glitches that the Georgian current informal or state capture has.
And just for our listeners, in case anybody's not familiar, the Anak Aliyah port project is a deep water port on the Black Sea that the United States has been encouraging Georgia to build. And up until now, the government said it wanted to build that basically would have turned Georgia into a transit hub, and would have been done wonders for the economy, and I would argue do wonders for its national security. But go ahead, Bud.
Yeah. And this summer, Secretary Pompeo, when he met previous prime minister who Bidzina Ivanishvili removed and installed a new one right now, formally state secretary described several problems of Georgian statecraft, democracy, elections, freedom of the speech, but also he highlighted Anak Aliyah port as an important demonstration of Georgia's real economic and political orientation. He warned Georgia not to be poised to be aligning its integration vector towards Russia or China's predatory interests and stay in connection with the free economies. So that was the warning, but since then everything happened against the Secretary Pompeo's warning. The consortium has been dissolved or coerced by the Bidzina Ivanishvili by his personal decision. He gave favor to another businessman and discredited the Khazaradze. The another issue is that there was no legal procedures. The one person decided. Then, because of his decision, and it's obvious that it was his personal decision, prosecutor's office launched the 11-year ago case of allegedly money laundering
against Japaridze
and Khazaradze, who are the owners or who were the major actors in this Anak Aliyah consortium, pushing them to give up their interest or their rights to be a member of those consortium. And it was clearly communicated. An entire state system, together with the propaganda machine, were targeting those two individuals and also the Anak Aliyah project.
And which from what and I'm not a lawyer, of course, but when I look at what this case looks like on the surface, it looks utterly ridiculous. I mean, it's like the Russians haven't dreamed up a case this ridiculous. Actually.
And by the way,
you mean the criminal case?
The criminal case against Japaridze, the money laundering case, is if I follow that case properly, he took out a loan and he paid it back, and that's money laundering, right? That's my understanding of that case, and in its simplest, which means I must be laundering money every month when I pay my mortgage.
It's absolutely ridiculous. Nobody believes.
And I know Japaridze. He strikes me as a pretty honest guy, and his story is absolutely inspirational. I mean, he had like $500 in his pocket, and he formed what is now the biggest bank in Georgia and the most reliable bank in Georgia.
But this is also another symptom of informal governance. Informal ruler Ivanishvili cannot tolerate any independent money, which might potentially have an independent political taste as well. So this is also key component why Anak Aliyah project was coerced. But also, just to add one thing, why the entire informal system is fighting against. Just recently, and US is our major strategic partner, and General Ben Hodges was mentioning and describing the importance of Anak Aliyah port, and Georgian economic minister immediately replied that the General Hodges had no full information or not correct understanding what Anak Aliyah means. Well, we can only laugh.
Right. No, I mean, it was actually General Hodges that brought Anak Aliyah, brought the geopolitical importance of Anak Aliyah to my attention. And because I have long been arguing that Georgia, when the Georgian government was trying to get into NATO actively, I was arguing that you have to turn yourself into an asset. You can't say help us poor Georgians because we have to live next door to big bad Russia, because that's not going to work. You got to move the Germans. You got to move the French, right? And I said the way to move those reluctant allies is to turn yourself into an asset, and assets must be protected. And the Anak Aliyah port turns you into an asset. If this becomes a hub of East-West trade, not only does it compete with Sochi, which the Russians don't like, but as General Hodges said, you build that port, the U.S. Navy will be there. Right?
Exactly.
No, I mean, he's speaking metaphorically, of course, but the idea is that Georgia has an economic assets. Economic assets must be protected. Therefore, you will have more interest in wider interest in the alliance. And the Russians are not dumb. They get this.
Absolutely.
Now, we don't know if the order came down to Moscow through Bidzina and then down to the courts to break this up or not. But we do see the result, right?
Que bono.
Yeah.
Who benefits from
right,
this?
Yeah. Kamu vygrata.
Yeah.
Don, jump in.
I just want to take up a point with what Batu just said before the port discussion, which is this issue of money and whose money is it. I think we talk a lot about Sistema, Brian and I and everybody on the program, as we should, but this patrimonial element of money and power is a fundamental driver of the system. And I'm reflecting my Richard Pipes background, but it's a fundamental driver of the system, not just here, but in Russia. And until we clean up make the rule of law stronger to prevent this kind of thing, we're going to have this problem. I talked to a very high-ranking Russian official about another oligarch who's active in the sports industry in the United States, or was. And I asked how much this oligarch had, and she said, it doesn't matter because it's all Putin's money anyway.
Right.
It's all his money anyway. They're just using it to buy whatever team they might.
Well, Don, I'm glad you mentioned Richard Pipes, who was one of the greatest minds and the freedom fighters, and also was honorary consul of Georgia in the U.S. Yeah. The lessons that he was describing from the Cold War period are very adequate today as well. So when we are trying to confront the Russian aggression or Russian intolerance to democracy that quite eloquently Surko described in his manifesto, and you had a brilliant podcast analyzing.
Thank you. No, we had fun doing that.
Yes, manifesto. But again, where this influence goes or how it is channeled where there is a corruption, where is there informal money. This is the lubricant of the system. Yeah. As much as you decrease this space, of course there will be attempts, but we will be more resilient towards this, and that's why following the money is very, very important, right? Yeah, no, I mean, and we've done research here at SIPA on what we're calling Putin's dark ecosystem, which looks at the conditions which allow Russian malign influence to this virus to spread. Mm-hmm. And it's corruption, it's organized crime, it's polarization, and it's low public trust. And Georgia previously was immune. If we go back to my introductory remarks where I said, 10 years ago, what was happening, because you had a society, you had low corruption, thanks to the previous government. You can criticize Misha all you want. He did do a good job on corruption. You had low organized crime. I mean, you have to be crazy to arrest every Vor of Zakonia in Georgia in one night, but he did that. And you had at that time, low polarization. Now we're seeing Georgia still scores well on corruption indexes, but it's losing ground. The last couple of Transparency International reports, Georgia's losing ground. It's organized crime is you're still probably pretty strong there, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see a bit of a comeback. But polarization is where it's just ripped right open in the last 5 years. I've never seen this society so polarized, and this is something that makes Georgia vulnerable right now. And I want to kind of segue from there, because I want to kind of we're all optimists by nature in this room, and I want to shift to the optimistic side of what we can do about it. I think we've diagnosed the problem here. So in a few moments, we'll continue our discussion with David and Batu and get their take on how the hell do we get out of this mess. I'd like to remind you are listening to the Power Vertical podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. Joining us here in the studio are two former Georgian ambassadors to the United States who just so happen to be in Washington at the moment. David Sikharulidze, who also serves as Georgia's defense minister, and Batu Kutelia, who also served as Georgia's intelligence chief and deputy secretary of Georgia's National Security Council. Also with us in the studio is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. I'd also like to remind you could subscribe to the Power Vertical podcast on iTunes. You could read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at sipa.org. And you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. Well, we painted a pretty bleak picture in the first half of the program, and since we don't want to ruin everybody's weekend, I think it's time to inject a little bit of optimism.
Point one, Georgian public opinion is still overwhelmingly pro-Western, pro-EU, pro-US, and pro-NATO. Second, Georgian civil society seems to be coming of age. And this is something you cannot help but notice in Georgia right now, especially among the younger generation that is not part of this politicized generation, is not part of this generation that grew up in the Soviet Union. This is the first generation coming of age that knows nothing but an independent Georgia. And finally, there's the West. The backsliding and the creeping Russian influence is taking place at a time when the West, if not entirely absent, has been much less present and much less engaged and much more distracted than it has been in the past. And this, we hope, will change at some point. Dato, Batu, Don, your thoughts on this? How do you do? What are these three pluses? These three positives? Can they be built on? What more needs to be done here? How do we move out of this? How do we not lose Georgia?
Well, Georgia's yes, I absolutely agree that support for a pro-Western democratic way of Georgia's development in Georgia is more than support for all political parties combined.
Right.
Yeah, and this is something very solid ground that national consensus the wider national consensus can be built. And you are absolutely right when you are speaking about the polarization that is the main weapon against us by Russia. So increased polarization is that weakens the nation. Secondly, second and more important thing is that Western engagement.
Right.
We used to say years ago that Georgia is more than Georgia. You probably heard that expression during the conference, and then maybe from our friends, which meant that Georgia can show the bigger example for the countries of the region to generate optimism. So, and then mostly it has two components in it. Western engagement, which is absolutely essential, maybe not enough, but essential, and the internal optimism that we can do it and then change it. So I think that,
no, go ahead, finish your thought. And,
and then I think that these two components are absolutely necessary to move ahead and then proceed. So
I would agree, and I want to kind of drill a little deeper on that. And Batu, I loved your software metaphor. So let's pretend we're software developers. What kind of Georgian software has to be developed? In other words, what do Georgians need to do to make themselves more immune to this at the civil society level and at the opposition level? And second, what do we in the West need to do? I mean, I have some ideas about, I think we need to have a united Georgian opposition that gets over its tribal rivalries. Yes. I think that is
pro-Western,
absolutely
united.
Necessary. It's not sufficient, but it's absolutely necessary. What else would you add to that?
Well, I'm optimist as well, and my optimism is grounded on several key historical facts, but also the vision of future. Because right now we are in a process globally that the new construction of world order might be settled soon. How it will be depends, of course, not only on Georgia, but all of us who are on the brighter side of this conflict. So democracy is, and we are at the front line. For us to be protected on the front line, again, using technological words, first of all, we need the firewalls. Economic firewall, political firewall, to be protected of immediate attack. But this is not enough. For us to progress, we have to shift our operating system to the artificial intelligence. So we should be learning constantly on our mistakes and self-correcting our system. That's why I like American system. If you observe the American political life, it's again upswings of some crisis, political crisis, economic crisis, but after every crisis, United States comes much more stronger.
There's a learning.
We need this type of thing. Of course, overnight things will not get better in Georgia, even with the NATO membership, with the EU membership. But the most important is to streamline the processes. And we've seen it in other democratic countries who are also struggling in the Central Eastern European post-communist bloc countries. And Georgia is no more a post-Soviet country. It's a young, fragile, but democracy. Right. So that's why I'm very optimistic.
I mean, I would agree with that. And actually, one of the self-correcting things I would like to see happen in this cycle is, and I alluded to this earlier, was this tendency in Georgia for a ruling party to gain a supermajority and then behave arrogantly, and then lose power to another party that gets a ruling. What I would like to see for the first time in Georgia is a true coalition government. So, and you have basically 3 viable opposition parties right now that are all pro-Western, all pro-NATO, all pro-EU, all pro-US, but have trouble talking to each other for some reason I can't figure out.
Now it's better. Now it's better.
Right? It's getting much better. We hosted here at SIPA representatives of the three major opposition, the United National Movement, European Georgia, and the Republicans. And if you were to have to put together a coalition where you had to have give and take, and there wasn't a Misha, this dominant, charismatic, cult of the personality figure that's on top of this all, that you had a true European-style coalition government, I think that would go a long way towards moving Georgia forward. Don?
Yeah, I just thought that our friend Dutta was too easy on the West here.
We got to talk.
Let me make 2 points here. One is that I think the more visible U.S. support would be a break, and as much as we can fault the Western backing for Ukraine, I think it's been inadequate. I think it's still been stronger than for Georgia, and we need to address that. Militarily, I think it would be helpful to have, and Brian and I have talked about this, the partners, the NATO, EU business for the future clarified, because even if it's more vigorous on paper, but still vigorously progressed toward, I think the Russians might back off a little bit. And second, I was happy that Pompeo went to the region last week, but not happy that it was so transactional and not talking more about human rights and democracy. And I know that's the administration's style, and I understand that, but I think just talking about the importance of democratic values and the process is really important. And I think that by all, it's not just the U.S., the Europeans, Western Europeans as well, that can be done a lot more and unambiguously, because we get that we're always, whether it's Nord Stream 2 or this, we don't want to anger the Kremlin mode too much. And it's not provocative to stand up for your values and your interests. Just do it. And they're going to adjust and put them on the back foot for a while.
I agree, and you're absolutely right. Democracy and freedom are the backbone of the statecraft, democratic statecraft. And for Georgia to be an asset for the Western world, first of all, yes, we have to have this backbone. And this backbone then can be loaded with different components, a pragmatic components of being an asset, whether it's an energy security, Black Sea security, military cooperation.
Backbone 2.
Yes. Exactly.
What can we be doing better in the West, Don?
Well, I think for one thing, just values and words matter. I think the message has been very muddled. Where on the one hand we do this, on the other hand we do that, on NATO, on a lot of issues. Make a clear, unambiguous message. We deal with Putin, we don't deal with Putin. We complain about corruption in Ukraine, but we don't in other countries where there's more corruption. It just makes no sense to me. And it comes across as inconsistent and opportunistic, and it's not effective.
I think we do need to, we have to be more proactive about holding Ivanishvili accountable right now. I think, I've long said, I don't know where his money came from.
We need to find
I don't know how it, and I don't know how it, and then that opens up the possibility to a lot of things. But again, he is enjoying the benefits of ruling without any of the responsibilities of ruling. And I think we have to be much more vigilant about holding him accountable. And this fits into a larger piece. I mean, I see this as, I'm reluctant to use the word new Cold War because it's kind of thrown around too loosely, but we are in this normative struggle right now between two different systems. One that's based on institutions and the rule of law, and and one that's based on patronage and networks and arbitrary rule and informal rule. And these two things, these are two very real systems, just like communism and Western democracy were two very real. These are two real systems. You don't have the kind of the frightening ideological conflict that you had then because it manifests itself differently. It's kind of hard to scare people about kleptocracy.
I've seen the movie The Wizard of Oz.
I'm trying hard.
If the dog runs behind the curtain and the wizard is just more smoke and mirrors, that makes a political difference.
Yes. But we have to be clear that this is a systemic struggle and Georgia's on the front lines, and that therefore this is in our interest that Georgia succeeds as much as it's in Georgia's interest. And we got to keep, I know, Don, you and I push this message here in Washington and in other Western capitals as much as we can, but we got to get this to where it is a consensus in the foreign policy establishment. I think we're getting there on Ukraine.
Yeah.
I think we're really getting there on Ukraine, but I see Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova as one piece.
Yes.
And all three of them are extremely important. And there isn't an iron curtain, but there is a curtain of sorts dividing these two normative systems, and it runs right through. I'd argue it runs right down Rustaveli Avenue, quite frankly.
Very good. Yes.
But for our Georgian listeners, I want them to realize Georgia has many friends here.
Georgia does have many friends here.
Lose perspectives.
And if we are critical of the government, it's just out of a belief that I think friends need to be honest with each other.
Yeah.
If any of my friends in the Georgian authorities happen to be listening, everything we're doing here is because we want Georgia to succeed for Georgia, but it's also good for us. It's in our interest that Georgia succeed, and it's in our interest that this zone of liberal democracy or what have you, our side of this normative struggle is expanded. Because if we lose it in Georgia and we lose it in Ukraine, every Russian imperial project begins with these places, and then none of them ends there.
But there were rumblings of change in the neighborhood too. So what Georgia does even matters.
Exactly.
So any last words before?
We recall that yesterday was a birthday of President Reagan.
Yes, it was.
Yeah, and I recall that from, of course, books that there was a very important toast was made on his behalf when he visited London. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher raised the glass, and she said, I'd like to raise this glass for the person who put freedom on offensive where it belongs. So on this optimistic note, I'd like to say that, it's time to put freedom on offensive where it belongs, and I think it's long overdue.
No, I mean, it doesn't look good. I mean, right now it looks, there's a lot of reasons to be pessimistic, but I think there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic. And again, the first move has to be made by Georgians on this. I mean, you have to create the conditions at home to overcome this virus, because that's what it is. Don, any last thoughts? Batu?
Great to see our two friends here.
Yeah, it is great to see you guys here.
Well, just briefly, of course, there is a lot of things that Georgians have to do. We have to fight for our freedom. Again, referring to the President Reagan, freedom is always one generation away from extinction. So we have to fight for our values, but external engagement of our strategic ally, United States, is important because that will allow and it will create a new space for political life, removing the autocratic ruler or squeezing him out for a while. And then, of course, it's up to us whether we will manage to find common ground, common language and consensus. And that's why I think with the current interest from the US and the letters from the Hill, warnings from our American friends on a different level, is an indicator of the U.S. interest and engagement in Georgian politics.
I've been pushing where I can for potential hearings on the situation in Georgia on the Hill, because I'd like to kind of raise awareness. So on that note, we'll wrap it up. That's all we have time for today. I'd like to remind you have been listening to the Power Vertical podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. Joining us here in the studio have been two former Georgian ambassadors to the United States, David Sikharulidze, who also served as Georgia's defense minister, and Batu Batu Kutelia, who also served as intelligence chief and deputy secretary of Georgia's National Security Council, and who incidentally is currently the head of the the Atlantic Council's Georgian office. I'd also like to also with us here in the studio has been former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Thank you all for a lively, fun, and enlightening conversation. I'd also like to thank our producer, Karsten Schmidl, who's filling in for the ailing Michal Harmata, for keeping the lights on and all the complicated machines well-oiled and in working order throughout our discussion. I'd also like to remind you could subscribe to the Power Vertical podcast on iTunes. You could read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at sipa.org, and you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. Join us again next week. And now, as always, I leave you with something other than the ambient sounds of my favorite socially conscious Russian rapper, Noise MC.